The 47th floor of Gas Tower commanded a view of the city that most visitors found breathtaking. I am so glad you're here for today's story. If this is your kind of content, go ahead and subscribe, because tomorrow I've got another story you won't want to miss. Drop a comment and tell me where you're from. Now let's get into it. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a metropolis Harold Gass had reshaped with steel and ambition, a landscape of his own making. But today, Harold noticed none of it. At 52, he'd built an empire that displaced thousands, yet lately found himself staring at balance sheets that no longer held meaning. "Mr. Gass, your 2 o'clock canceled." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "And there's a boy here. Says he has information about the Riverside project." Harold frowned, pulled from his thoughts. "A boy?" "Yes, sir. Maybe 7 or 8 years old. Security tried to remove him, but he walked right past them. Said you'd want to hear what he has to say." The assistant's tone held equal parts confusion and concern. Curiosity piqued, Harold straightened his silk tie. "Send him in." The massive glass doors slid open, revealing a child so small he seemed swallowed by the corporate vastness around him. No more than 8 years old, with dark brown skin and natural curly hair framing a face far too serious for childhood. He wore a simple gray t-shirt and worn sneakers, a stark contrast to the Italian marble and designer furniture surrounding him. But it was his eyes that arrested Harold. Direct, unflinching, and carrying a weight no child should bear, fixed on him with unsettling purpose. "Mr. Gass," the boy said, his voice clear despite the tremor beneath it. "Thank you for seeing me." He approached the desk with measured steps, his small feet barely making sound against the polished floor. Harold fought the urge to dismiss him immediately. "You're welcome, young man. And you are?" "George Williams." The boy extended a small hand, which Harold shook instinctively, noting how his own palm completely engulfed the child's. With solemn ceremony, George reached into his backpack, faded and patched, and withdrew a photograph. He placed it precisely in the center of Harold's glass desk. Harold leaned forward. The image showed 2 women, one black, wearing a hospital housekeeper's uniform, standing beside a white woman in a hospital bed. Both were smiling despite the IV lines and oxygen tubes visible in the frame. Recognition struck like lightning. "That's your mother," George said quietly, his small finger touching the white woman's face. "And that's my great-grandmother Martha. She took care of her when you were too busy." Harold's breath caught. The hospital. 30 years ago. His mother's final days in the charity ward, while he closed the deal that launched his empire. George's eyes never wavered. "Now you're gonna kill mine." The words hung in the air, simple, devastating, undeniable. Harold's throat tightened. "What are you talking about?" "The Riverside project." George's voice cracked slightly. "That's where we live, where my grandma is. She's dying, Mr. Gass. The doctors say she has maybe a month, but your demolition starts in 4 weeks. Something shifted in Harold's chest, a sensation so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. "Young man, that's a business decision. There are relocation programs." "She doesn't want to relocate." George's composure wavered, revealing the terrified child beneath the brave facade. "She was born in that building. My mom was born there. I was born there. It's the only home she's ever known. And now she's dying, and you're taking it away before she can say goodbye." His small hands gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles pale with tension. "My teacher says you're the richest man in the city, that you can do anything. So I came to ask you." His voice broke. "Please. Just wait. Just a few more weeks. Let her die at home." Harold stared at the child, then at the photograph. His mother's face looked back at him, peaceful, cared for, surrounded by the kindness of a stranger, because her own son hadn't been there. "Where is your mother?" Harold heard himself ask. "At work. 2 jobs since Dad left." George's jaw tightened with premature anger. "She doesn't know I'm here. She said there's no point talking to people like you, because you don't listen to people like us." The casual categorization, "people like you, people like us," landed with uncomfortable precision. "Please," George whispered, tears finally breaking free. "Your mama got to die with somebody holding her hand. My grandma should too." Harold felt something crack inside his carefully constructed world. Children didn't enter executive suites. They didn't carry photographs proving karmic debts. They didn't speak truths that billionaires spent fortunes avoiding. Yet this one had bypassed security, navigated corporate intimidation, and placed a mirror before Harold Gass that reflected a man he barely recognized. "George," he said slowly, his voice rougher than intended. "I can't make promises I'm not sure I can keep. This project involves investors, contracts, legal obligations. I don't know what those words mean." George's shoulders slumped, defeat washing over his small frame. "I just know Grandma Martha cries at night when she thinks I'm asleep. And I heard her tell Mom she's scared of dying in a strange place." He reached for the photograph, carefully sliding it back toward himself. My teacher was wrong. You're not the richest man in the city. George's eyes met Harold's with devastating clarity. You're just the one with the most money. There's a difference. Before Harold could respond, George turned toward the door. Wait. Harold stood, instinct overriding calculation. How did you get here? Bus. Then I walked. George glanced back, suspicion evident. Why? Because I'm going to drive you home. Harold picked up his phone, surprising himself. Miss Chen, have my car brought around. Clear my afternoon. George's eyes widened. Why would you do that? Harold studied the photograph still lying on his desk. Evidence of a debt, 3 decades old, presented by a child with nothing to lose and everything to fight for. Because 30 years ago, a woman I never met showed my mother more kindness than I did. Harold's voice carried weight he hadn't felt in years. And I need to meet your grandmother. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the tower windows as Harold Gass descended from his glass throne, following a small boy whose courage had accomplished what no board meeting ever could, forcing him to remember he was human. Chapter 1. The Boy in the Tower. The security breach alert pinged on Harold's desktop at exactly 2:17 p.m. He glanced at the notification, unauthorized miner, 47th floor, and dismissed it with a swipe. False alarms were common. No one reached the executive level without clearance. Then his office doors opened. The boy stood in the threshold, small and determined, ignoring the security guard reaching for his shoulder. His gray t-shirt was faded, his sneakers scuffed, but he held himself with unsettling dignity. Sir, I'm sorry, the guard began. It's fine, Marcus. Harold leaned back in his chair, more curious than annoyed. Let's hear what he has to say. The guard hesitated, then retreated. George Williams walked forward, his footsteps silent on the marble floor. He stopped 3 feet from the desk and carefully withdrew a photograph from his backpack. This is your mother, George said, placing it between them. And this is my great-grandmother, Martha. She took care of her when nobody else would. Harold's eyes fell to the image. The charity ward, the housekeeper's uniform, his mother's skeletal frame in the hospital bed, yet somehow smiling. The memory he'd buried for 30 years suddenly breathed again. Now you're gonna kill mine, George continued, his voice steady but thin. Harold's jaw tightened. I'm not killing anyone, son. The Riverside Project. That's where my grandma lives. Where she's dying. George's hands gripped the desk edge. Your demolition starts in 4 weeks. The doctors say she has maybe 1 month. Harold straightened, his executive mask sliding into place. There are relocation programs. Your family will receive fair compensation. She doesn't want compensation. She wants to die at home. This is business, son, not personal. George's expression hardened, aged beyond his years. That's what people with money always say when they hurt people without it. The words hit like a slap. Harold stood, towering over the child. You don't understand how the world works. I have investors, contracts, legal obligations. I understand you could stop it if you wanted to. George's voice cracked. But you won't. Because my grandma's not important enough. Harold pressed the intercom. Marcus, escort our visitor out. Please. George reached for the photograph, but Harold's hand covered it first. Leave the picture. The boy's eyes widened with something between hope and fear. Why? Because I want to verify your story. Harold's tone was ice. If you're lying, there will be consequences. I'm not lying, George whispered. She's dying, and you're the only one who can help. Marcus appeared in the doorway. George didn't resist as the guard guided him out, but his eyes never left Harold's face, accusing, pleading, haunting. When the doors closed, silence consumed the office. Harold sank into his chair, the photograph burning in his peripheral vision. He tried to return to his emails, his calls, his empire, but his eyes kept drifting back to that image, his mother's face, the woman in the uniform, Martha Williams, holding her hand. He'd been in Chicago that day, closing the Sheridan deal. His phone had rung 14 times. He'd ignored it until his assistant finally interrupted the meeting. Your mother passed this morning. The hospital needs you to. He'd wired money for cremation. Never identified the body. Never asked who'd been there in his place. Now he knew. A woman named Martha Williams had held his mother's hand while her own son built an empire. And 30 years later, that woman's grandson had walked into his tower, carrying proof of a debt Harold never knew he owed. He picked up the photograph with trembling fingers. Outside his windows, the city glittered with indifference. Inside, something Harold thought long dead began to stir, something uncomfortable and insistent. Conscience. Chapter 2. Ghosts of Charity Ward. Harold stared at his computer screen long after his staff had gone home. The personnel records from Mercy General Hospital glowed in the darkness. 30 years of archived files, accessed through connections money could buy. Martha Williams. Housekeeper, 1989 to 2003. He scrolled through her employment history, each entry a testament to quiet dedication. 15-hour shifts, perfect attendance, commendations for extraordinary compassion beyond job duties. Then he found the supervisor's note dated March 15, 1994. Mrs. Williams has been staying past her shift to sit with terminal patients who have no family present. While we appreciate her kindness, she must be reminded, this is not part of her job description. Harold's hand stilled on the keyboard. March 15, 1994. His mother had died March 18th. He opened another file, the hospital's patient log. His mother's name appeared with clinical precision. Eleanor Gass. Admitted March 3rd, stage 4 lung cancer. No visitors. No visitors. The words carved into him like a scalpel. He'd been in Chicago. The Sheridan deal. The one that transformed him from millionaire to mogul. His phone had rung during the final negotiation. Once. Twice. 14 times. He'd silenced it. When his assistant finally interrupted, her face pale with urgency, he'd barely looked up from the contracts. Your mother passed this morning. He'd signed the deal first, then wired money for cremation, handled the arrangements. He'd told his assistant, I'll fly back next week. He never did. Now 3 decades later, he sat in his tower and understood what he'd traded for empire. His intercom buzzed, shattering the silence. Mr. Gass, just confirming. Riverside demolition crew starts work in 28 days. Should I send the final approval to the contractors? 28 days. 4 weeks. Roughly the time George's grandmother had left. Not yet, Harold heard himself say. I'll review it tomorrow. He closed his laptop and stood, drawn to the windows overlooking the city. Somewhere in that maze of lights was Riverside, a property designation on blueprints, a line item on balance sheets. He'd never actually seen it. 20 minutes later, Harold sat in his Bentley as his driver navigated toward Brooklyn. The neighborhood shifted from glass and steel to brick and graffiti. When they reached Riverside, Harold ordered the car to stop. Wait here, he said, stepping onto the sidewalk. The housing project rose before him, 6 stories of weathered concrete and flickering streetlights. But it was alive in ways his tower never was. Children played basketball in a makeshift court. Elderly men played dominoes on a stoop. A woman hung laundry on a fire escape, humming softly. Harold stood at the periphery, invisible in his expensive suit, watching people live in the building he'd designated for death. A little girl ran past chasing a soccer ball, her laughter piercing the evening air. She looked about 8, George's age. The demolition order sat in his briefcase, awaiting his signature. That night, Harold lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling. The city hummed below, but all he heard was silence. The same silence that must have filled his mother's hospital room. He tried to remember her voice, the way she'd said his name, the song she'd hummed while cooking. Nothing came. 30 years of empire building had erased her completely, leaving only the photograph of a stranger's kindness as proof she'd existed at all. At 3 a.m., Harold rose and retrieved the photograph from his briefcase. He studied Martha Williams' face, a woman who'd shown his mother more love in her final days than her own son had in years. And now that woman lay dying in a building he'd condemned. The equation was brutally simple. He could save his deal and lose his soul, or save his soul and lose everything he'd built. Harold set the photograph on his nightstand where his mother's picture should have been. Sleep never came. Chapter 3. The Visit. Harold felt absurd in jeans and a plain sweater, clothes he hadn't worn in a decade, retrieved from the back of his closet like artifacts from another life. Without his armor of tailored suits, he was just a man approaching a building he'd sentenced to death. The lobby smelled of cooking spices and disinfectant. A handwritten sign pointed toward Community Hospice Care, 2nd floor. Harold climbed stairs that groaned under his weight, past walls covered in children's murals depicting gardens and sunshine. Room 204's door stood ajar. Martha Williams lay in a hospital bed positioned by the window, sunlight illuminating her silver hair like a halo. She was smaller than he'd imagined. A wisp of a woman, her brown skin papery with age, her breathing shallow but steady. I was wondering when you'd come, she said without opening her eyes. Harold froze in the doorway. How did you? George told me. Her eyes opened, sharp and clear despite her body's frailty. But I would have known anyway. You have your mother's eyes. The words struck him speechless. Martha's smile was gentle, knowing. She was so proud of you. Showed me the newspaper articles about your business. Said her son was going to change the world. Harold's throat constricted. She never told me that. Because you never visited. Martha's tone held no judgment, only truth. But she still loved you. Talked about you every day until she couldn't talk anymore. The room tilted slightly. Harold gripped the doorframe for support. I held her hand when she passed. Martha continued softly. Told her stories about my own boy, George's grandpa, to keep her company. She wasn't alone at the end. I made sure of that. Why? Harold's voice cracked. You didn't know her. You didn't owe her anything. Baby, nobody should die alone. Martha's eyes held infinite compassion. That's not about owing. That's about being human. Footsteps thundered up the stairs. George burst through the door, stopping short when he saw Harold. Grandma. His small body moved between Harold and the bed, protective and fierce. It's all right, baby. Martha reached for George's hand. Mr. Gass came to talk. He came to say no, George said bitterly. That's what people like him do. Harold flinched at the child's perception. Martha studied Harold with unsettling clarity. Let me ask you something, Mr. Gass. Did all that money make you happy? The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. Harold opened his mouth, closed it. No words came that weren't lies. That's what I thought, Martha said gently. My Eleanor, your mama, she worried about that. Said you were chasing something that kept moving further away. I built an empire, Harold said weakly. But who did you build it for? Martha's hand trembled as she gestured toward the window. Look outside. Tell me what you see. Harold moved to the window. Below, the courtyard teemed with life. Children played tag around a fountain. Teenagers painted a mural on the wall. Elderly men played chess at concrete tables. A young mother pushed a stroller, stopping to chat with neighbors on a bench. I see. Harold struggled for words. People. You see home, Martha corrected. 3 generations of families. Babies born here. Elders dying here. Weddings in that courtyard. Funerals too. That's what you're demolishing, Mr. Gass. Not buildings. Lives. George pressed against his grandmother's side, his young face etched with adult grief. I have investors, Harold said, the excuse hollow even to his own ears. Contracts. Legal obligations. You have a choice, Martha interrupted, her voice suddenly steel beneath the frailty. Same choice you had 30 years ago when that hospital kept calling. You chose money then. Her eyes held his. What will you choose now? Harold stood paralyzed, watching the community below, the life he'd reduced to blueprints and profit margins. Martha's breathing grew labored. George immediately reached for her oxygen mask, his small hands practiced and gentle. You should go, George said quietly, not looking at Harold. You're upsetting her. Harold backed toward the door, shame burning through him like acid. Mr. Gass, Martha called weakly. He turned. Your mama's last words were about you. Martha's smile was sad and knowing. She said, tell my boy I forgive him. And I hope someday he forgives himself. Harold fled. Chapter 4. The Boardroom Battle. The emergency board meeting convened at 8 a.m. sharp. 12 directors sat around the glass table, their expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed irritation. Harold stood at the head, the photograph of his mother and Martha Williams projected on the screen behind him. I'm recommending we halt the Riverside project, he said without preamble. Silence. Then chaos. You're what? Richard Chen, the CFO, half rose from his chair. Halted. Indefinitely. Harold, this is insane. $800 million, someone else interjected. We've already spent $200 million in acquisition and permits. Harold raised his hand. The room fell silent, though the tension vibrated like a living thing. I've reviewed the numbers. I understand the financial implications, but there are human considerations we haven't adequately addressed. Richard's laugh was sharp and humorless. Human considerations? Harold, we're a real estate development company, not a charity. We've followed every legal requirement. Relocation packages exceed city standards. Relocation packages don't replace home, Harold interrupted. And they certainly don't give a dying woman the dignity of her final days in the place she's lived for 60 years. The board exchanged glances. Margaret Sutton, the head of acquisitions, leaned forward. Harold, is this about the boy who broke into your office? This is about doing what's right. What's right? Richard stood now, his tablet thrust forward, displaying spreadsheets. We have contractual obligations to 17 different investors. Construction crews on standby. Architectural firms, contractors, suppliers, all waiting. If we halt now, we're liable for breach of contract across the board. We're talking lawsuits that could cost us more than the project itself. Let them sue. The room erupted again, multiple voices overlapping in a cacophony of disbelief and outrage. You'll tank our stock. Shareholder confidence will evaporate. Harold, think about what you're saying. I have thought about it. Harold's voice cut through the noise like a blade. For 3 days, I've thought about nothing else. Then you've lost perspective, a voice said from his left. Harold turned. His wife, Victoria, sat with her hands folded on the table, her expression professionally neutral. She was on the board as a major shareholder, and right now, she looked at him like a stranger. Victoria, you're having a midlife crisis, she said calmly. I understand. Mortality is frightening. But you can't let personal sentimentality destroy what took 30 years to build. This isn't sentimentality. This is conscience. Conscience doesn't pay dividends, Richard said flatly. And it certainly doesn't honor fiduciary duty to our shareholders. Margaret cleared her throat. Harold, I appreciate the emotional complexity of this situation. But we're a publicly traded company. You have legal obligations beyond personal feelings. If you can't separate the two, perhaps you need to reconsider your position as CEO. The threat hung in the air, unsubtle and effective. Is that what this is? Harold looked around the table. A coup? It's a reality check, Richard replied. You're asking us to flush $800 million because a child made you feel guilty. That's not leadership. That's instability. Harold's hands clenched at his sides. I'm not asking. I'm telling you. As CEO and majority shareholder, I'm halting the project. Then we vote to override, Victoria said quietly. Board majority can supersede CEO decision-making in cases of fiduciary irresponsibility. Harold stared at her. You'd vote against me? I'd vote for sanity. Her eyes were cold. I'm sorry, Harold. But this isn't you. This is grief or guilt or whatever you want to call it. And I won't let you destroy our company because of it. Richard called for the vote. Hands rose one by one around the table. 11-1. Only Harold stood alone. Then I resign, Harold said, his voice dangerously quiet. Effective immediately. And I'm liquidating my controlling shares. The room went silent. You're bluffing, Richard said, but uncertainty crept into his tone. Try me. Harold leaned forward, palms on the glass table. You want to proceed? Fine. But you'll do it without me, without my name, and without my capital. I'll crash this company before I let you bulldoze that building with Martha Williams still inside. Margaret's eyes widened. Harold, you're talking about destroying your own legacy. My legacy is already destroyed. I'm just deciding whether to rebuild it or bury it. The stalemate stretched, taut and terrible. Finally, Victoria spoke. 14 days. We give you 14 days to find an alternative solution. If you can't, the project proceeds as planned. Harold straightened. That's not enough time. It's 14 days more than you deserve, she said. Take it, Harold. Or we vote to remove you entirely. He looked around the table at faces that had once been allies, now hardened into adversaries. 14 days, he agreed. The meeting adjourned in bitter silence. Chapter 5. Between Two Worlds. Harold returned to Riverside the next morning wearing the same casual clothes, feeling like an imposter in both worlds now. Too corporate for this neighborhood, too compromised for his boardroom. George sat on the front steps, bouncing a worn basketball. He looked up as Harold approached. Suspicion etched across his young face. Grandma said I should show you around, George said flatly. So you can see what you're destroying. I'd appreciate that. George stood, tucking the ball under his arm. Don't mean I trust you. I understand. They walked through the complex in tense silence. George pointed out landmarks with the mechanical delivery of a reluctant tour guide. That's where Mrs. Patterson teaches piano. That's the community garden Mr. Lopez started. That's where we play ball. But as they moved deeper into Riverside, George's narration softened, became personal. He introduced Harold to Miss Ruby, a 78-year-old woman who'd lived in 3A for 52 years. To Marcus, a veteran who organized the Youth Basketball League. To Shanice, a single mother of 3 who worked 2 jobs but still found time to run the after-school program. Each person was a universe Harold had reduced to a demolition line item. By afternoon, word had spread. A community meeting formed in the courtyard, residents gathering with arms crossed and eyes hard. Harold stood before them, acutely aware he represented everything they had reason to hate. Why should we trust anything you say? A woman called out. You're here because you got caught, not because you care. You're right, Harold admitted. I didn't care. Not until... He stopped, unable to finish. An elderly Chinese man stood, leaning heavily on a cane. I'm David Chen. My wife died in apartment 5C. Lung cancer, like your mother. His eyes met Harold's with quiet intensity. But I was there. I held her hand. Our children were born in that apartment. Our grandchildren learned to walk on that floor. His voice cracked. Where am I supposed to go with $8,000? What home can I buy with the value you placed on my life? Harold had no answer. Another resident spoke. Then another. Stories poured out. Generations of memories, struggles overcome, communities built from nothing. Each story was a nail in the coffin of Harold's justifications. A young activist stepped forward. You've built 47 luxury buildings in this city. Ever ask yourself who lived where you built them? Harold shook his head slowly. No, I never asked. Because you didn't want to know. She gestured to the crowd. We're not just poor people to you. We're inconvenient truths. The accuracy of it hollowed him out. As the meeting dispersed, George sat beside Harold on a bench. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then George asked, "Were you always rich?" "No." Harold's voice was rough. "I grew up in a place like this. South Side. My mother cleaned houses to pay rent." George's head tilted, processing. "So you know what it's like, having nothing." "I do." "Then why?" George's voice rose with genuine confusion. "Why you taking from people like you used to be? You know what it costs." Harold looked at the boy, this 8-year-old who saw through every excuse, every justification, every carefully constructed wall. "Because I forgot," Harold said quietly. "Or maybe I chose to forget. It's easier to take from people when you convince yourself you're nothing like them anymore. But you are like them." George's eyes held disappointment that cut deeper than hatred. "You just got lucky. And now you're using that luck to hurt people who didn't." The truth of it sat between them, undeniable and damning. An elderly woman approached, her hands wrapped in a shawl despite the warm day. "Mr. Gass, I'm Helen Rodriguez. I knew your mother." Harold's breath caught. "You knew Eleanor? She cleaned houses in our old neighborhood." "Including mine." Helen's smile was sad. "She was proud of you, but also worried. Said she was afraid you'd forget where you came from." Harold's eyes burned. She was right to worry. Helen placed a weathered hand on his shoulder. "It's not too late to remember." As the sun set over Riverside, painting the worn buildings in golden light, Harold watched children play, where his demolition crews were scheduled to arrive in 12 days. 47 luxury buildings, thousands displaced, decades of erasure, all in the name of progress, and he couldn't remember a single face of anyone he'd destroyed along the way. Until now. Chapter 6. The Breaking Point. The call came at 4 a.m. Martha had been rushed to Mercy General, the same hospital where Harold's mother had died 30 years earlier. Harold arrived before dawn to find George curled in a chair outside the ICU, still wearing his school clothes from the day before. The boy's eyes were red-rimmed but dry, as if he'd cried himself empty. "They won't let me in yet," George said, his voice small and hollow. Harold sat beside him. "Has anyone called your mother?" "She's working the overnight shift. I left a message." George's hands twisted in his lap. "Grandma was fine yesterday. Then she just wasn't." The ICU doors opened an hour later. Martha looked impossibly fragile against the white sheets, machines beeping a rhythm that sounded like borrowed time. George took his grandmother's hand, and Harold stood at the foot of the bed, an unwelcome witness to private grief. Days blurred together. George refused to leave, sleeping in the chair, eating whatever Harold brought from the cafeteria. Harold found himself returning each morning, then staying through the afternoon, then into the evening, sitting, watching, keeping vigil with a child who shouldn't have to bear this alone. On the 5th day, Martha's eyes opened with sudden clarity. "Harold," she whispered. "Come closer." He moved to her bedside, George still clutching her other hand. "Your mother's last words," Martha said, her voice thread-thin. "I never told you all of them." Harold's throat constricted. She said, "Tell my son I forgive him." Martha's eyes held his. "And tell him I hope someday he forgives himself." The words broke something fundamental inside Harold. 30 years of carefully constructed armor shattered. He wept, great, heaving sobs that shook his shoulders, for the mother he'd abandoned, for the life he'd wasted, for the man he'd become. George stared at him, wide-eyed, as if witnessing something impossible. Martha's frail hand reached for Harold's face, her touch impossibly gentle. "She saw your potential, baby. I see it too." Her breathing labored. "But potential means nothing if you don't use it right. You understand?" "I understand," Harold choked out. "Martha, I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize to me. Apologize by doing better." Her eyes drifted closed. "Be the man she believed you could be." The machines began screaming. Harold pulled George back as nurses flooded the room. Code blue. Crash cart. Electricity jolting through Martha's chest once, twice, 3 times. George buried his face against Harold's side, trembling. After an eternity, Martha's heart rhythm returned, weak, irregular, but present. The doctor emerged 20 minutes later, his expression grave. "We've stabilized her, but her heart is failing. Without intervention, we're looking at hours, maybe days." "I'm sorry." George broke from Harold's grip and grabbed the doctor's coat. "You have to save her. We're doing everything we can." "No, you're not." George's voice cracked. "There's medicine, there's surgery, there's something." "George," Harold said gently, kneeling beside him. "Sometimes medicine can't." "Then get her home." George turned to Harold, desperation raw on his face. "Please. She wants to die at home. You can do that, right? You can make that happen?" Harold glanced at the doctor, who shook his head slightly. "The building has no medical equipment, no way to manage her pain or..." "She doesn't need equipment." George's hands fisted in Harold's shirt. She needs home. She needs to see her walls, her pictures, her view. She needs to die where she lived. The simple truth of it pierced Harold's chest. He looked at Martha through the ICU window, this woman who'd given his mother dignity in death, who'd shown him more grace than he deserved, who was dying in a sterile room instead of the home she'd built over 60 years. And he looked at George, 8 years old and already intimately acquainted with loss, begging for the one thing money could actually buy: choice. "I'll handle it," Harold said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "I'll get her home." "You promise?" George's eyes searched his face. Harold thought of all the promises he'd broken, all the people he'd failed. But this he could do. "I promise." By nightfall, Harold had mobilized a team: hospice nurses, portable medical equipment, around-the-clock care. He called in favors, threw money at problems, wielded his power for something other than destruction. And in 12 hours, they would move Martha Williams' home to Riverside, to the building Harold had scheduled for demolition in 7 days. Chapter 7: The Choice. The ambulance arrived at Riverside at dawn, followed by Harold's hired medical team, hospice nurses, oxygen equipment, monitors that could track Martha's failing heart in the comfort of her own home. Word had spread. By the time the stretcher emerged, the sidewalk was lined with neighbors. Silent, reverent, bearing witness to one of their own coming home to die. Harold helped carry the stretcher, his hands unaccustomed to the weight but steadied by the paramedic beside him. They navigated the worn stairs carefully, 2nd floor, room 204, while George led the way, clearing a path through the gathering crowd. Inside, Martha's apartment smelled of lavender and old books. Photographs covered every surface, generations of family, frozen in moments of joy. The hospice team worked efficiently, transforming her bedroom into a medical space that still felt like home. When they finally settled Martha into her own bed, beneath quilts her mother had made, her eyes fluttered open. "I'm home," she whispered. "You're home," George confirmed, his small hand gripping hers. Martha's gaze found Harold standing at the doorway. "You kept your promise." "I did." "You're a good son," she said, her voice barely audible. "Eleanor would be proud." The word struck Harold like absolution he didn't deserve, but desperately needed. He nodded, unable to speak, and quietly left the room. Outside, neighbors thanked him with handshakes and tearful embraces. Miss Ruby pressed a warm casserole into his hands. Mr. Lopez clasped his shoulder. "You did a good thing today, Mr. Gass." Harold drove back to his penthouse as the sun set, the city lights beginning their nightly shimmer. He stepped into his apartment, 12,000 square feet of marble and glass and crushing emptiness. Not a home, a monument to achievement, a beautiful sterile tomb. His phone buzzed. Richard Chen's message was brief and brutal. "Board vote finalized. Sign demolition order by 9 a.m. tomorrow, or we invoke the removal clause. Your choice, Harold. Legacy or sentiment?" Harold stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Then he grabbed his keys. The cemetery was closed, but money opened gates even in the dark. Harold navigated by phone light until he found it. A simple granite marker he'd purchased remotely 30 years ago and never visited since. Eleanor Margaret Gass. "Beloved mother." He sank to his knees in the damp grass. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Mom." The words came haltingly at first, then, in a flood. 30 years of apologies, regrets, confessions. He told her about the empire he'd built, the lives he'd displaced, the man he'd become, someone she wouldn't recognize, someone he barely recognized himself. "Martha took care of you when I didn't. And now I'm supposed to destroy her home, her final days, for money." His voice broke. "For a legacy that means nothing." The night air held no answers, but sitting there in the darkness, Harold felt something shift. A clarity settling over him, like his mother's hand on his shoulder. He'd spent 30 years building monuments to fill the void where his humanity used to be. 47 buildings that reached toward heaven, while crushing everything beneath them. He could build 47 more, and still die empty. Or he could stop. Harold pulled out his phone and dialed Richard's number. It rang 4 times before the CFO answered, his voice sharp with sleep and irritation. "It's 2 a.m., Harold." "I'm not signing," Harold said quietly. Silence. Then, "You understand what this means? We'll remove you. You'll lose everything." "No, Richard. I've already lost everything. I'm just now figuring out how to find it again. You're making a mistake. I've made nothing but mistakes for 30 years. This is the first right thing I've done since my mother died. The board will destroy you." Harold looked at his mother's gravestone, moonlight catching the carved letters. "Then let them. I'm done destroying other people to save myself." He ended the call before Richard could respond. The cemetery was silent, except for the wind through the trees. Harold sat until dawn broke, light spilling over the gravestones like forgiveness. When he finally stood, his knees aching and his suit damp with dew, Harold felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 decades. Not happiness. Not yet, but the possibility of it. He placed his hand on his mother's headstone. "I'm going to do better, Mom. I promise. I'm going to be the son you believed I could be." The stone was cold beneath his palm, but somewhere deep in his chest, something warm flickered to life. Purpose. Chapter 8. The Fall and the Rise. The board removed Harold at 9:15 a.m. By 10 o'clock, the news had broken. By noon, gas industry stock had plummeted 18%. By evening, every major outlet ran the same story. Billionaire's CEO ousted after refusing demolition to save dying woman. The media couldn't decide if he was a saint or a lunatic. His board knew which. Victoria's lawyer delivered the divorce papers personally. "She asked me to tell you this is nothing personal. Just practical. You're financially suicidal, and she won't go down with you." Harold signed without reading them. What followed was a liquidation that made financial analysts weep. The penthouse sold for $40 million, below market, but Harold needed speed over profit. The vacation homes in Aspen and Monaco went next. Then the art collection, piece by piece. The yacht. The vintage car collection. Even his shares in subsidiary companies. Every dollar funneled toward one goal: buying Riverside outright, paying back investors, and clearing the legal minefield he'd created. The board sued for breach of fiduciary duty. Harold's legal fees mounted into the millions. At night, he worked by laptop light in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, a space smaller than his former walk-in closet. A knock came one evening. Harold opened the door to find George standing in the hallway, his mother hovering protectively behind him. "Can I come in?" George asked. Harold stepped aside. George surveyed the sparse apartment. Second-hand furniture, bare walls, a view of a parking lot instead of Manhattan skyline. "You gave up everything," George said quietly. Harold closed the door. "No, I gave up nothing. I'm finally getting something." "What?" Harold knelt to George's eye level. "A chance to be someone worth being." George studied his face with that unnerving childhood directness. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. Harold shook it, and for the first time in weeks, something like peace settled in his chest. "Grandma wants to see you," George said. "She's writing something. Won't tell me what." The legal battle intensified. Harold's former colleagues lined up against him, their testimonies damning and precise. Erratic behavior, emotional instability. Abandoned his responsibilities for sentimental delusion. Then the community mobilized. Residents testified about Harold's transformation. Pro bono lawyers from legal aid organizations joined his defense. Letters flooded the court, hundreds of them, from families Harold had spent weeks getting to know. Miss Ruby, Mr. Lopez, David Chen, whose testimony brought the courtroom to silence. And Martha, in her final lucid days, wrote a letter in shaking handwriting. Harold didn't read it until the judge did, aloud in court. "I am dying, but I want you to know I've seen something rarer than wealth these past weeks. I've seen a man remember his humanity. Harold Gass's mother, Eleanor, was my friend in her final days. She told me her greatest fear was that her son would forget kindness in his pursuit of success. For 30 years he did. But her grandson, my great-grandson George, reminded him, this case isn't about breach of duty. It's about a man finally honoring the duty that matters most, to be human. I won't live to see how this ends, but I pray you'll give him the chance to finish what he's started. Not for him, for all the children like George who need to see that change is possible, even in men who've forgotten how." The courtroom was silent except for muffled crying. 3 weeks later, the settlement came. Harold would pay back investors at 60 cents on the dollar, relinquishing all claims to gas industries. In exchange, he retained ownership of Riverside, free and clear. He'd lost his company, his fortune, his marriage. On paper, he was ruined. But when Harold walked out of the courthouse to find George waiting on the steps, Martha's letter folded carefully in the boy's pocket, he felt something he'd never experienced at the height of his wealth. Wholeness. "Grandma passed this morning," George said, his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. "She waited until she knew you'd won." Harold knelt and pulled the boy into an embrace. They stood there on the courthouse steps, a disgraced billionaire and an 8-year-old orphan, holding each other while the city moved around them. "What happens now?" George asked. Harold looked up at the sky, then back at the boy. "Now we rebuild. But this time, we build something that lasts." Chapter 9. Full Circle. Martha Williams died at 6:42 a.m. on a Tuesday, sunlight streaming through the window of apartment 204. George held one hand, his mother the other, while neighbors filled the doorway, a community bearing witness to the passing of their matriarch. Harold arrived an hour later, to find the apartment transformed into a shrine of grief and gratitude. Candles flickered on every surface. Residents spoke in hushed tones, sharing stories of Martha's kindness spanning 6 decades. George sat on the floor beside his grandmother's bed, still holding her hand though it had grown cold. Harold knelt beside him. No words felt adequate. She waited, George whispered, until she knew you'd saved Riverside. Then she let go. The funeral filled the Riverside courtyard 3 days later. Hundreds came. Families Martha had helped, children she'd mentored, neighbors who'd become family. Harold stood at the makeshift podium, acutely aware he was the outsider, eulogizing a saint. "I never knew my mother's final days," he began, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "But Martha Williams did. She held my mother's hand when I didn't. She gave her dignity when I gave her nothing." His throat tightened. 30 years later, Martha's great-grandson walked into my office and showed me what I'd become, a man who'd forgotten every lesson my mother tried to teach me. He looked at George in the front row, tears streaming down the boy's face. "Martha Williams saved 2 lives. My mother's last days. And my soul." Harold's voice broke. "I only wish I'd been wise enough to know her longer." After the service, George approached Harold, clutching a folded letter. "Grandma wrote this, said to give it to you after." George's hands trembled as he passed it over. Harold unfolded the paper, Martha's shaking handwriting barely legible. "Harold, your mother talked about you constantly. About the boy who built forts from cardboard boxes and shared his lunch with hungry classmates. She said you had the biggest heart of any child she'd known. When George described meeting you, I saw that boy again, buried, but not gone. Thank you for proving her right. Thank you for letting me meet the son she always believed you could be." "Martha." Harold's vision blurred. George stepped closer, his small hand finding Harold's. "Grandma said you remind her of the boy your mama talked about," George said softly. "She said she finally got to meet him." 6 months later, Riverside had transformed, not demolished but reborn. The building stood refreshed with new paint, repaired infrastructure, and solar panels gleaming on the rooftops. But the most significant change was invisible. Community ownership. Every resident now held equity, their homes secured through the cooperative Harold had established with his remaining wealth. The Harold Gas Foundation for Affordable Housing operated from a small office on Riverside's ground floor. No marble, no mahogany, just desks, filing cabinets, and walls covered with architectural plans for projects across the city. Affordable developments that preserved communities instead of displacing them. George visited every Saturday, arriving with his backpack and questions that grew more sophisticated each week. Harold had become his unofficial mentor, teaching him about architecture, urban planning, and the mathematics of building things that mattered. Today they sat at Harold's simple desk, blueprints spread between them. George studied the plans for a new community center, the project's crown jewel. "These support beams," George traced the lines with his finger. "They're like the ones in my building." "Exactly. See how they distribute weight? Engineering isn't just about making things stand up. It's about making them last." George looked up, his expression thoughtful. "You gonna build towers again, like you used to?" Harold set down his pencil. "No, I'm gonna build homes. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Towers are about height, how far you can rise above everyone else." Harold tapped the community center plans. "Homes are about foundation, how many people you can lift up with you." George nodded slowly, processing. "Grandma would like that." "I hope so." They worked in comfortable silence, the afternoon light slanting through windows that overlooked the courtyard where children played and elders watched from benches, the same scene that had first pierced Harold's conscience. "Mr. Gas?" George's voice was tentative. "Harold, how many times do I have to tell you?" "Harold," George corrected with a small smile. "Can I learn to do what you do? Build homes, I mean. Not towers." Harold felt something warm expand in his chest. Not pride exactly, but something deeper. Purpose passed from one generation to the next. "I'm counting on it," Harold said. "Someone needs to keep doing this work when I'm gone. Might as well be someone who understands why it matters." George's smile widened. He bent over the blueprints again, asking questions about load distribution and sustainable materials, and how to design spaces that felt like community. Harold answered each one, patient and thorough, teaching the boy his grandmother had sent to save him. Outside, the city hummed with its usual chaos. But here, in this small office, in a building that almost became rubble, something quieter persisted. Not empire, not wealth, legacy. As the sun set over Riverside, Harold watched George sketch modifications to the community center design. Small hands creating something that would outlast them both. "I spent 30 years building an empire," Harold thought, watching the boy work with fierce concentration. 47 towers reaching toward heaven, while crushing everything beneath them. "I measured success in floors, in height, in how far I could rise above the place I came from. It took an 8-year-old boy to teach me what my mother knew all along. The only thing worth building is something that lifts others up. The only legacy worth leaving is the one that helps people stay home. George looked up from his sketch, pride shining in his eyes. I think Grandma Martha would like this design. Harold studied the boy's work. A community center with gardens, learning spaces, rooms designed for gathering and healing and growing. I think your grandma and my mother are both smiling right now, Harold said quietly. And for the first time in 30 years he believed it. The camera of memory pulled back. 2 figures bent over blueprints in a modest office, building something that would never reach the skyline but would shelter generations. Not a tower. A home.